Well, thanks so much, Angela. And thanks to the Columbia Public Library, Daniel Boone. I really appreciate being hosted here. The library is such a treasure for our city, and I love going there. And so it's a real joy to kind of be a part of these events, and then to have the book in the library, and to really, experience that sort of joy. So I wanted to, first of all, thank everybody for coming, and those who are watching this recorded, because that's kind of the world we're in now. There are a lot of ways to access these things. And I wanted to talk a little bit about the book, Child in the Valley. I'll read a little bit from it, and then am happy to address any questions or comments that come through. I know the book's been out for about a month now, maybe a little over a month, 5 weeks or so. The interesting thing I think about that is that it's getting to the point where some of these events, people have read it, and that's always fun to kind of experience their reactions to it, and see how it sort of is living in the world, which is, I think, is just one of the treasures of putting something like this out there. But for those who haven't or don't know much about it, basically, Child in the Valley is about a 17-year-old orphan who goes to California during the 1849 gold rush. He is fleeing some debts left after the death of his adopted father, who was a doctor. And so he joins up with this really vagabond gold rush party, and travels with them to the gold fields of California in the American River near Sutter's Mill, which was really the place where the gold boom happened in 1849. Along the way, the book tracks his kind of moral descent, explores ideas of sexuality and violence and greed, and kind of a lot that was happening in frontier America, and in that really sort of frontier mid-19th century space in this genre, which I talked a little bit about the book being a kind of Western or anti-Western as I've talked about it, but using those kind of genre elements as the book unfolds. So I wanted to read just a little bit from the beginning. It's after the prelude. Joshua has arrived in Independence, and he is sort of seeking shelter while he's about to kind of start doing his search for a gold rush party. And then I'll talk a little bit more about kind of the writing process, and the really special thing that the book is written here in Columbia, which I think is really great. So this is from the early part of the book, Child in the Valley. The first 3 hotels Joshua inquires in are full. The fourth is a good distance from the square, tucked in a grove of hardwoods so that it stays perpetually in shadow. After he wipes his dusty boots on the rag rug, he discovers it has 1 vacancy. You've got to share it though, says the innkeeper. Not the bed, I mean, just the room. Joshua weighs his options while the man stares at him and scratches his cheek and chest ape-like as he grows visibly impatient with the silence. The man taps his pen on the ledger, points at the medical bag. That yours? I'm the one carrying it. The man frowns at this wit, though he lets the slight go as quickly as he'd reacted to it. So you a doctor then, huh? He says. The assumption, so simple and so declarative, is to Joshua the very embodiment of possibility, a future of reclamation and self-definition. He is a doctor here because he chooses to be, as he can choose to be anything, not an indebted young man twice orphaned in the span of 17 years, for instance, and so in turn be that by his choosing. I've never seen one before myself, the man continues. You look different than I'd expect the doctor to look. More normal, except for that limp you got. What happened to your foot there? Joshua looks at the innkeeper for a moment without reaction. Then he shrugs. The innkeeper frowns. I see, he says. Reminding himself that this is the only hotel with a vacancy, Joshua checks his sediness. He turns and regards the bulbous wax figurine on the end of the counter. It looks like nothing more than a gnarled ball, but he's seen enough terrible crafting on the streets of St. Louis to know a terrible crafter will never refrain from talking about his terrible crafts. Did you make that? Joshua asks. I did, the innkeeper says proudly. I sculpted that bust out of old candles. It's me, see? The innkeeper picks it up and holds it beside his face as if to mirror that kinked visage. The nose that angles so severely toward the corner of his mouth Someone must have beaten him silly once. Joshua glances from the bust to the man whose jaundiced skin mimics the color and consistency of the wax, rendering an even greater resemblance between the two. A malfunction in the liver, Joshua thinks. Gives the place how is it the frogs say it? Raison d'etre, says the innkeeper. He nods and sighs deeply and satisfyingly. I see it now, Joshua says, and he's not lying. So, the main innkeeper smiles, pulls the key off its hook, slaps it on the wooden counter. You want the bed or not? For $7 a week? The innkeeper smiles again and shrugs. There's no supply, but there sure is demand. And what if I don't stay a whole week? Do I have to pay the full $7? If you aren't here by the end of this week, the innkeeper says, it means you're on your way to the gold fields. So you won't need that $7 then. Consider it an offering to those of us less fortunate than yourself. Joshua frowns. What does this man know about the state of his fortune? And why would someone so presumptuous about the riches to be found in California not abandon his post and strike out west himself? $7 is more than he'd planned for his stay here, but he knows he has no choice. He's tried the other hotels. He's seen the congested streets that seem to birth wagons. He pulls out a mix of $2 notes and coins and hands them to the innkeeper. Top of the stairs, second room on your right, number 3, the innkeeper says, pocketing the money. As Joshua watches the bills depart, it dawns on him why the innkeeper is staying put when so many from this country and otherwise are landing here just to keep going west. This man has already discovered his gold, because only those whose nothingness is the result of someone else's somethingness, the indebted, the destitute, the fathers, the lovers, must mine the earth for its raw and hidden treasures. Joshua grabs the key, heads upstairs. A brass 3 hangs horizontally from a loose middle screw, looking like a pair of testicles. The hallway is nearly dark with no window, and there's no light coming from under the room's door. Joshua puts his ear to the dense wood, hears nothing. Still, he knocks before walking in, but he finds the room empty. Later that evening, the wind turns in a cold front. His roommate, a preacher, returns in silence and falls fast asleep, a woolen blanket pulled over his gigantic body and tucked underneath the white thicket of a beard that disappears his chin. Joshua shivers as he lies in his bed, the wind issuing from the open window and sharp with human stink. He's staring at the ceiling, at the gobs of cobwebs decorating the black and amorphous water stains that resemble tumors, and he's wondering what this world is he's brought himself into. He had a home in St. Louis. He had a father, which meant he had a sort of love that even now reluctantly clings to him in pieces. But life, like the body he knows, must have no past. It must recalibrate, reformulate, reconstitute to usher forward. Only the mind can wallow in has-been. So Joshua closes his eyes and pictures California, or at least what he imagines California to be. A flat and verdant land glistening like a field after a summer rainstorm, luscious rivers that are so filled with the gold, the water takes on the color and texture of honey. Outside his room, scattered mounds of half-melted snow recrystallize, rainbow in the setting sun like diamonds. The wind churning a dust plume that hovers just above the macadam, just above the animals' hooves, the oxen, the mules, the horses, like the whole town is stuck in a kind of low-lying mist and bestowed in an undue mirage. Struggling to hold this precious image of California in his mind, while his heart tugs him backward in time to a complex sorrow, Joshua wraps his arms over his body for warmth, but refuses to shut the window. The cold will Spartan him, bring him clarity and rigor, all of which he believes is the key to his prosperity, was the key to his father's lack of it. Come nightfall, it begins to pour. So I chose that section in part because it's from an early part of the book, but in another way, I think that section is a really kind of formative moment for Joshua. It's the first time that he's arrived in independence. It's the first time that he's really experienced a world apart from traveling to St. Louis to independence that is a kind of likeness to the world that he will enter into out in California. And there's a little bit of a shell shock and kind of culture shock that I think he's going through, all while trying to grow up because he's 17. And so to me, it's just a really interesting moment, that he's just trying to find a hotel, and, he's finally kind of landing on this, but the realities of what he's sort of embarking on are setting in. I was talking to Angela before we started this event, and one of the things that I mentioned to her, which I mentioned at the start of sort of my own remarks, is that I wrote this book here in Columbia, and that's true. I started the book here in Columbia, and I wrote it, and I finished it, and then had it published while I lived here in Columbia. And I think that there's something very special about that. I think that there's a way in which Columbia offered me insights into not only the history that I was looking at, but sort of the role that Missouri played in the formation of the American Union in the mid-19th century, and the sort of migratory role that Missouri played. I mean, it was really a massive kind of jumping off point for so much of what the country was to become after 1849 and on into the 20th century. And when I was sitting down to write this book, one of the things that I really kind of had in mind was wanting to explore the rise and fall of the American Union and the ways in which America was shaped in the mid-19th century, and how that has since impacted how we think about kind of the mythology of America, and how we think about sort of ourselves as Americans, and define America both ideologically, but also practically, in terms of kind of its geography, and in terms of sort of who is here and who belongs here, and sort of who we argue who belongs here, and who we argue is American, or is becoming American. And all of these things, I think, were swimming around in my head while I was staying at my aunt's house, and thinking about the creation myth of America. And this documentary came on the History Channel, and it was about a doctor from Boston, Dr. Charles Robinson, who had left his family and come to Independence to join a gold rush party, to travel out west to get rich. And at that moment, the idea of a doctor on the trail and what that would mean to be a doctor on the trail sort of gave me the seed to put all of those ideas together. Because I really started to think about, okay, if I'm really interested in this sort of formation of the American Union, but you can also investigate, the ideas of science and the ideas of religion in the mid-19th century, and then use the gold rush, which to me was such an important moment in American history in terms of how we shaped the country afterward. It felt like a very cohesive way to tell a story, and it felt like a very rich narrative for a novel. And so that's how Child in the Valley was kind of born. Born out of those ideas, and then born out of that documentary of Dr. Charles Robinson. And even though Joshua isn't based on Dr. Charles Robinson, Dr. Robinson in his own life's journey really kind of, for me, seeded the idea for Joshua, and the idea of a 17-year-old doctor on a trail going out to California to try to kind of strike it rich, and then encountering all the challenges that he encounters, and sort of having to go through this self reckoning and personal reckoning, and all while trying to grow up. So that, I think, is how I really kind of came into the project, and then spent a year and a half writing it, and then another couple of years revising while I did a bunch of research, which included, going out into California and camping in the gold fields, and learning how to pan for gold. I actually took gold panning lessons with a park ranger out in the American River, alongside a bunch of 10-year-olds, because I think it was billed mostly for children. But they let me do it. And then, when I was getting married out in California, my now wife, we actually drove the entirety of the California Trail, and from Independence all the way out to the goldfields. And so really, putting myself into kind of that research space, and having those kind of experiential moments to embrace and experience as a way to write the book, really helped kind of push it along from the early phase where I was doing a lot of book research, into the kind of middle phase where I could really hone in on the landscape, and sort of use my own experience to help drive, what it would look like for Joshua and his party, to then push the book into its final iteration, which is ultimately kind of what we have here. So that's kind of the story of the book. That's kind of loosely just, some of the research that I did and how I got there. I don't know if anybody has any questions, or if Angela wanted to sort of ask anything. But yeah.
Sure. Yeah. I do have some questions. So I was just curious, you were talking about your path on how you wrote this. How long did it actually take you to write the entire book?
So that's a good question. It was probably from start to, so I'll say this, from like the start of it, right? The idea was like 2014, and then 2021 was the publication. So for me, the act of writing the first draft was about a year and a half. It took me about a year and a half to get a first draft down. And the first draft was actually quite a bit longer. It was about 145,000 words. And this final version is only about 84,000, 85,000, something like that. So almost half of what the first draft was. So I wrote a first draft in kind of a year and a half. And really, what was so interesting about that is I felt like I had so many kind of ideas and so much sort of momentum behind it, but I hadn't done a lot of research. And so I was trying to write slow enough so that I could just stay enough ahead of the book to do the research that I needed to get him from, page 30 to 31 or 32 or 33. And there was a period where in spring break 2014, my aunt, who had owned a farm in Kansas City and lived out in Kansas City, she was a Jackson County state judge, had passed away from astrocytoma, brain cancer. And she had, we were going to sell the farm and kind of sell her house because she didn't have any kids. And she and I were really close just because I was living in Columbia and I'd spend time with her and my other aunt, my grandmother, in Kansas City. And so it was a spring break in 2014. And at that time I was teaching at the university, and I had a key to her farm that the bank didn't know that I had. And so I drove out to Cleveland, Missouri, which is where the farm was, and unlocked the gate and drove my car in and went into the house. And the bank had cleared it all out and they'd shut off the water, but they hadn't shut off the electricity. So I at least knew that I would have heat, but I carted out a bunch of water and I took a camping cot and I took a TV tray and a chair and a box of Alfred Hitchcock movies. And I spent the full week just like waking up and writing and then eating and then, watching an Alfred Hitchcock movie at night and then going back to bed and like starting the whole cycle over again, all while, walking around the farm and kind of trying to process that loss and, and the ensuing loss at the farm, because that had been a really big part of my childhood. It had been owned by my grandfather and then she had bought it from him. So it had been in the family since I was born. And that really blitz of writing, I wrote about 55,000 words and got Joshua all the way to the trail, and had been simultaneously doing a lot of research on the trail. And so I felt like, okay, I was far enough ahead of myself that I could dive into the trail section. And so then I went forward with that. And that's really, I think, what took the most time to revise, because then I had to, a couple of years later, I went out and did that research in the gold fields. And then a couple of years after that, I did the drive on the California Trail. And so really that experiential research shaped the kind of second two parts of the book, because that's really kind of what I had to learn and how I had to get there. And then my agent and I spent some time editing. And then of course the publication process is always a process. So it was 7 years start to finish, probably about 4 to 5 to really kind of write and get to a point where I felt like it was ready to go.
We also have a question from Barbara. How much did the events and characters in the book change along the way of you fully developing the story? And then what surprised you about the process of writing a book?
Yeah, the characters, some of them actually were sort of born whole in the book. And really, that is particularly true with the characters that he goes onto the trail with. So Renard, Free Ray, Clayton and Clayton, the twins, and then G. Quillard, the Englishman. Those characters were born kind of fully whole. Joshua's character, I think what was most interesting to me about his evolution is that initially I didn't have him being kind of a full-blown doctor. I had him being the son of a doctor, or the foster son of a doctor. And so I had him understanding medical, or having medical knowledge in kind of an ancillary way. But what changed is that I really sort of shaped him into an actual doctor, someone who wanted to pursue the profession in his own way, and in his own right. And that was a very intentional move, because I felt like the more that I wrote into the book, the more it was important for me for him to have this kind of drive and motivation and profession, apart from just wanting to get rich for the sake of getting rich, but to also have a skill set that was very uniquely his, because I felt like that distinguished him then also as part of that party, that he could play a role no one else could play. So then he, in effect, becomes an asset to that party in a way that no one else is, except for Renard and Fourier, who kind of know the way. They're an asset because they're the guides, but G. Quillard and the Claytons are kind of just, going along. So that was, I think, a really big change as far as the characters. And then, of course, interestingly, some of the minor characters changed. Like in this section, I mentioned a preacher that Joshua is roommates with. And I had written a whole section of the book where Joshua encountered a preacher when he was traveling from St. Louis to Independence, and wound up joining up with that preacher, and then going to Independence with that preacher, and actually being almost like adopted by that preacher as a second father while in Independence. And I scrapped all of that. And so that preacher actually becomes, in this book, nameless, even though he had carried a name and a history, and there had been this whole kind of relationship between them. And I scrapped all of that as I was sort of fine-tuning the book and really streamlining the book, because pacing was a very important part of it to me. And I felt like that was just going on a little bit too long. So that was kind of an interesting moment. And then, as far as being surprised about the process of writing a book, I think that for me, the process of writing a book is very sequential. I start at like page 1, and then I just work my way through it. I don't really plot things out. I often don't really have a sense of where the book is headed too far ahead of where I am in writing the book. And I think for me, the most surprising part of that process has been just learning to trust that process. I think it can be difficult to trust that process. And sometimes I can get too much into my head and think, am I going to be able to do it? I don't know what's going to happen next. And I really had to kind of let myself settle and live in the moments that I was writing. And then that would just in turn birth the moments that were coming after that. So I think for me, that was the most surprising part of it, is that I really learned to trust myself and trust the process as a process and embrace it to write the novel.
Well, I have another question. You kind of mentioned this earlier, and I thought I think that's really interesting. I really want to know, what is it like being a premier author during a pandemic where everything is like not in person, and how you pictured it might be in your life? I'm a debuting author and these are the things I'll do, but now we have a pandemic. How does that work for you?
Yeah, it's a good question. I still feel like I'm conflicted on what it's like being a debut author in a pandemic. I feel very fortunate to be a debut author, period. I mean, I think that that's something that can never be taken away, right? Regardless of the world. I also feel fortunate that I'm on the second year of the pandemic and not the first year. I think that has afforded a little bit more opportunity than that first year. I mean, I had friends who actually released books in spring 2020, and that was just a terrible environment to release books, and they did well, and they, I think, had success in a lot of ways, but that's just tough, right? When the news cycles are consumed with the pandemic, and people are preoccupied in completely different ways than we've ever been in terms of our lives, right? Our lifetimes. It's tough to be a debut author. I think for me, the biggest loss was that when May came around and this book was coming out at the end of August, and we were planning the book tour and kind of all these events, we were planning in person, right? And I had all these in-person events lined up. The Mississippi Book Festival, the Louisiana Book Festival, other events in South Carolina and Florida. And, by late June, July, that was just kind of scrapped. I mean, the book festivals were canceled, everything was shifting virtually. And so I think for me, the hardest thing was that I had started to believe in a kind of book launch and a book tour that was more like I had always imagined it would be, in person and kind of engaged that way. And then that was kind of, it just felt a little robbed, right? And I think that the world felt robbed, right? We had all this hope, and then all of a sudden it's gone, right? And we kind of revert back to a winter 2020 scenario. So that's been tough. I think virtual events are beautiful in their own right. I mean, they allow access in a way that I think in-person events don't always. They also, live forever, which has been really interesting. And another author friend of mine, we were talking about the fact that I think you have to be more aware of what you're saying and like what you're reading in virtual events, because it's recorded. And so you don't want to just sound like a parrot if people watch 2 recordings. You want to try to bring something new. So I've tried to read different sections of the book, and I don't think I would have done that if it was in person. You kind of go more into a rhythm. So I think there are benefits to that, but the lack of, I think, just that back and forth that you get in person, and the energy of being in person, it's just something I think that can't quite come through as much in virtual. So there have been downsides, there have been upsides. I will say in general, I'm super proud where the book is, and kind of how it's doing. I feel like authors always want more. So, so there's that too. But yeah, it's been good overall. Hopefully if I, when and if I do the second one, it will not be in a pandemic. Yeah.
We have a question, I think, from Marlene. How important is the language to writing an anti-Western and bringing fresh perspective to the traditional westward movement story? I feel your writing style, the descriptions, the vocabulary are as fresh and intense as the originality of the Western story.
Well, that means a ton coming from Marlene, because I know Marlene is a beautiful writer. And she and I've had the privilege to read her work. And we've actually had workshops together, talked a lot about writing and stuff. And so thank you, Marlene, for that question and for being here. I think that I think the language is essential. I mean, I think that I'm super into language as a mechanism for fiction. I have mentioned this before, that I feel like fiction writers, there are a lot of different tools that you use to write a novel, right, or to write a short story. And I feel like fiction writers have those tools in their tool chest that are their go-tos, the ones that they are most adept with. And then there are those tools that we know we have to focus on learning and focus on developing. When you think about what those tools are, dialogue, language, plot, character, setting, pacing, right? So all these different things. For me, one of the tools, dialogue, I always felt like was a tool that I kind of could use a little bit intuitively. And then language was always something that I was always drawn by and felt kind of propelled my fiction. And so for me, writing a book with, strong language and kind of original language was always really important. It felt especially important for this book, in part because I felt like if I was going to dive into the Western genre, particularly as a white male writer today, it had to be in a way that was opening that genre up in ways that I feel like the genre is often not opened up. Historically, the Western has been a very exclusive genre, not only in terms of the writers that are writing Westerns, but also the experiences, the identities, the perspectives that are embraced in Westerns. And so, once I realized that this book was going to be kind of a Western or an anti-Western, the next imperative was writing it in a way that pushed against a lot of those exclusions and writing it in a way that allowed me to sort of open it up. And And so for me, some of that was thinking about what language could do, particularly around issues of violence and like sexuality and, setting, because I think that there's a way in which the West is often romanticized and glorified, and I just didn't have that perspective. I felt like the book needed to be a hard book. I mean, I know that some of the words used to describe it are brutal and haunting, and I think that's true. I mean, it's a difficult book, and it's a challenging book, and probably a little bit risky. And so I felt like if the language didn't carry that, then it would just kind of like fold in on itself. So it was vitally important for me to kind of do that. And it was also vitally important for me to, I feel like, write in a way that felt contemporary. I mean, I didn't want the book to feel historical, even though it's historical. I wanted it to be able to survive in a kind of now moment, even if it's set 150 years ago. And the most challenging thing about that is that when you start writing a book, it's always responsive to the moment in which you started. And when I started this in like 2014, you never know, is the book going to still feel relevant by the time it's published? And, when you think about that 7-year journey, there was no way for me to know what world it was going to enter into. So I always felt like, I had to write it in a way that could feel fresh whenever it would come out. And I don't know how deliberate that was, because I don't know, I'm not a prophet. I couldn't see what that would look like. But I just felt like if I was intentional about it, hopefully I could be successful in it.
Well, you kind of alluded to, well, you made a comment about if there's going to be a second book.
Yeah.
I as a writer, do you kind of have little things that you just kind of keep, little, I don't know, notepads of like story ideas? Like, how does that work? Are you planning another book?
I am. Yeah. I think I am planning another book in the abstract. I'll say that. I think that there have been a lot of like life moments for me in the last year, especially. I've had my first child, a daughter, who has consumed a lot of my creative time, as children do. And so, part of, I think, what I've been balancing is what my writing life looks like in this new iteration. Because when I wrote this book, and when I wrote the majority of it, I was really like single, living on my own, working. I had time was not a problem, right? I had time. And now that's a little bit different. So I do have another, I feel like I have another book in me, yes. I also feel like I want to do something different. And I think that for me, the process of writing happens in my head for quite a little while before I actually sit down. Because once I actually sit down and go, with this book, I had actually a few false starts. And it was like, once I hit that first sentence, that is actually this first sentence, I knew this is the tone and tenor of the book, and then like ran with it. And I haven't hit that first sentence yet with the second book. I know what I want the second book to be kind of about. It's a contemporary novel. I think loosely it's going to be about a man who returns to try to salvage a outfitter store in a mountain town in Colorado that was established by his grandfather, and then that his mother embezzled money from, and it's on the verge of bankruptcy. So he comes back to trying to kind of salvage it, and it's about that sort of like reckoning of coming back to his hometown, and dealing with the isolation there and stuff like that. I think that that's what the book's going to be about. I haven't quite nailed sort of the tenor and tone of it, but I know that it will come at some point. So I guess when I say if and when, the if is more if I could find the time, like, now I'll get going on it. Otherwise, it'll be the when I can find the time, in a little bit. Yeah.
I know I'm hogging all the questions here, but I'm always curious about authors. Do you ever get tired of writing?
No,
Like
I don't.
when you think about how long your process took, I mean, the first one, of course, from start to finish took about 7 years, and I realized editing takes up a large portion. But writing that story for so long, I'm always curious if you tired from just the story itself, maybe not writing in general, but the story itself, or
I never did. I felt at times very frustrated by the story and at times very challenged by it. That never translated to being tired of it. It actually translated to not knowing why I couldn't see what I felt like was right in front of me. You know, um, s- Cormac McCarthy made this comment at one point that I think has always really stuck with me. He said, "You always have this perfect image of a book in your head, and then you write it, and it is never that image. It never lives up to that. So the next book is this perfect image, and then you write that, and it never lives up to it. So then there's the next one. That's it, right? You're always like searching for the perfect image. I think for me, writing is my life in a lot of ways. I mean, speech writing at Mizzou, writing essays, writing novels. I never tire of writing. I really, though, I'm in this period now where I'm thinking a lot about writing, not actually writing. That is important for me to go through because I feel like if I don't let myself think about a project and think about a book, I tend to get more frustrated when I sit down and write because I feel like I'm just not wedded to the material in the right way, and that the writing is not happening in the way that I want it to happen. It doesn't mean that it's easy. I mean, writing for me is actually hard. All kinds of writing is actually hard, and which then feels kind of masochistic that it's like my job, like my other job. But I think it's hard because I care so deeply about it, and I'm so attuned to what I feel like it could be, and that everything I produce is probably, you know, um, 4/5 of that. Yeah.
so do you ever think you would write? I mean, you said something about maybe writing something a little different, but different being something that's not fiction, maybe nonfiction, or kind of staying in the fiction realm, but maybe kind of a different genre.
Yeah, I am really interested in genre. I think that I'm really interested in using genre elements. So, like, one of the things that I've actually been thinking a lot about is horror, and how to sort of infuse horror elements into this new project that I'm working on. I call that being a bridge writer. Like thinking about genre in a sort of both a genre and a non-genre way, sort of fusing the literary and the genre. I'm really interested in that. So I think there's a way in which I'll always try to kind of search that out. I've also been really interested lately in doing more essays. I've been thinking a lot about book reviews and have sort of been talking to different publications about doing some different book reviews, because I think nonfiction is a very it's an interesting avenue for me. It allows me to use voice in a little bit of a different way. It also allows me to process and think through some of the things in the world that I'm very preoccupied by, and some of the things like culturally I'm very preoccupied by outside of fiction. I can be a little bit more didactic about that stuff, that I can't be in fiction. So yeah, I am sort of exploring other things. Nothing. Fiction is really the only thing that I'm exploring right now in book form. Everything else is more short form. But it's been kind of an interesting endeavor. Yeah.
Well, I think I don't have any more questions. If anyone else has any other questions, feel free to share those. Okay, maybe I do have one more question.
Yeah.
Uh, so I know you're talking about like you're kind of in writing with the speech writing and everything, but so do you belong to like a writing group? Do you meet with other authors to kind of like just sit down and kind of maybe do some creative writing or anything like that?
I've gone through periods in my life where I have. Marlene and I, and Lynn Shorey were part of one. Lynn's another writer in town along with Marlene. We were kind of a little trio for a little while. And then I directed the Quarry Heights Writers Workshop for several years, which then, kind of with COVID went on hiatus and hasn't really been picked up since then. I did some stuff with the Columbia Writers Guild, or the Missouri Writers Guild in Columbia. I do have friends that I am very close with, on both a relationship and sort of writing level, who I share work with. For me, what I've learned is that if I share too early, sometimes it can overwhelm me, because I think what happens is that people see things in my work that I haven't seen yet, and it's better for me not to see that sometimes, because then I don't become preoccupied with trying to realize what they're seeing too early, you know. And so I tend to write things in a very kind of like solitary way for a little while, until I really feel like I understand what it is that I'm doing and how I'm doing it, so that I can then buffer some of the feedback or criticisms that I get, and see how that can help me, even though it won't overwhelm me. So, you know, I think a lot of writers do it in a lot of different ways, but I think that's why I kind of sometimes go internally. And interestingly, the other thing I've learned is that I write much better in the winter. And I think it's because I feel very overexposed in the summer with the heat and the sun and like the longer daylight hours, the more darkness, like the grayness. It actually allows me to kind of sink into myself a little bit, and become a little bit more internalized, which helps when I write. Yeah.
Well, that's really interesting. Yeah, that's really, really interesting. I'd like to thank everyone for joining us this evening. Thank you so much, Gordy, for spending some time with us and talking about your novel. And I'd like to thank everyone for joining us, and come join us again for another program.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. Thanks everyone for being here.